the Toronto Star. I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. This summer, the City of Toronto made a forceful decision that cost almost $2 million, hundreds of private security guards and police to forcefully evict the homeless. In strange contrast, the city once again was unable to make a decision on a 10-year-long debate on legalizing multi-tenant rentals. It's the second time in the last few months that the City Council has decided to delay the decision on legalizing and regulating rooming houses across Toronto until next year. Rooming houses are also called multi-tenant homes and are currently illegal in most of Toronto. But ground reality is different. Like me, I'm sure you know of at least one person who's had to rent or is renting a rooming house. They're often the only accessible and affordable living option for so many. Students, newcomers, the lowest income individuals in a city where the cost of living is among the highest in Canada. For some, it can mean the difference between shelter and eventually being evicted from a public park. And experts say regulating this living situation can help stop exploitation of renters and open up options of housing for many who are currently living in precarious and unsafe situations. So, what's the holdup in this decade-long saga at City Hall? Star columnist Shawn Micallef wrote about this recently, and he joins me now to talk about the significance of renting rooms, renters' rights, and why this conversation should not have taken place the way it did in the middle of a pandemic and an escalating housing crisis. Hi, Shawn. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, what's the current debate on multi-tenant housing or rooming houses, and why has it been going on for nearly 10 years now?
Yeah, the city staff at the City of Toronto have been trying to put together a policy for 10 years or more on legalizing and regulating rooming houses. Right now, sometimes they're called multi-tenant homes or rooming houses. Basically, it's renting a room in someone else's house rather than renting a whole house or a separate apartment. Like if you remember that movie, It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart and all that, the mom in It's a Wonderful Life ran a rooming house. And they exist all over Toronto, from Scarborough to Etobicoke to North York, but they're only legal in a certain part of the city. Parts of Etobicoke, parts of the old city of York, and the old city of Toronto. And so by regulating them, it kind of brings them up from the sort of underground economy and allows the city to go in and see if they're safe and that sort of thing.
Right, because that's the legal framework that they're still operating in. And you kind of explained the significance of rooming houses to many people, especially newcomers, through a kind of personal lens through the story of your great aunt, which was really interesting to read. Can you tell me a little bit about her?
As I was listening to the debates on rooming houses over the summer and recently at City Council, it just kind of like appeared in my brain that, oh yeah, my great aunt from Nova Scotia, from a small fishing village in Nova Scotia, she always told this story when she first came to Toronto after the war, took the train from Nova Scotia, got off at Union Station, and there was a welcome desk there for newcomers. And it kind of hooked them up with places to stay. And my aunt was a single woman in her early 20s, with not very much money. And there was a woman just north of Bathurst and Queen, whose husband was away at work, and she rented out rooms to young single women. So it was like an accommodation that, it was safe and that sort of thing. And she had registered with this desk. And after that, she lived with a Polish family that rented out rooms. And that's how she got her start in Ontario. And then, she moved out of Toronto to Windsor, Ontario, and opened a TV shop. And if it wasn't for a rooming house, she probably would not have been able to, get that first foothold in Ontario, in Toronto.
Yeah, and I mean, even now, I feel like I can relate to the story because as a newcomer, even if my situation was not entirely the same, but I ended up renting a room from a friend and her family. It's hard to rent out a whole unit when you're still disoriented. Not a lot of people rent to newcomers, not to mention the cost issues, right? How important is this kind of affordable alternative right now, especially as we're dealing with a full-blown housing crisis?
Yeah, it's basically the first step, right? If you're a newcomer, if you don't have good credit, if you don't have any credit, because you haven't done anything to get credit, you can't rent, a formal apartment because everyone who's rented has to fill out all those forms and the banking information and your income and that sort of thing. it's a lot easier, to rent a room. Students too. I mean, like students who come to Toronto to our 4 universities and 4 colleges, many of them live in rooming houses. Though maybe we don't actually think of them as rooming houses. But if you go out to Scarborough and walk around, UTSC, University of Toronto Scarborough campus, a lot of those kind of suburban looking homes, they rent out rooms to students, international students, students from other parts of Canada, but they're all underground right now. But it absolutely exists.
Right. And this lack of legislation and sort of regularization around this, does that contribute to creating unsafe and potentially exploitative conditions for many who have no options but to live in these arrangements? Because I've read and heard of so many horror stories of young kids, young international students who live under some horrific conditions and have no recourse because there is no standardization on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lovely landlords in the underground economy who rent out their rooms and they're perfectly good and they probably have breakfast every morning and that sort of thing. But there's enough endless horror stories of, people being taken advantage of living in dangerous rooms and basements with, not appropriate exits, no smoke alarms and no carbon monoxide alarms and all the kind of, standard issue safety stuff that people who are properly housed would take for granted and don't even think of, put a new battery in the smoke alarm or something, that's all we think of it. Whereas, there's people who live like this every day in Toronto and there's no way of regulating it. I remember maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there was a building on Yonge Street at Wellesley that became a sort of dorm tenement for students. A lot of U of T students and Ryerson students, international students often, who didn't know what they were getting into, and the city moved in and shut it down. So that was a really big version of the kind of unsafe, precarious conditions that people are in when this stuff is shoved underground.
We'll be right back. And yet, as you mentioned, Toronto Council seems to be having a very different conversation around people who might need this kind of rental arrangement. During the debate on this last week, a silent majority was mentioned in the council meeting, referring to a population apparently of Torontonians who are homeowning who might not want these kinds of renters living near them. And therefore, the vote has once again been deferred to next year. So, first of all, who is the silent majority? And also, this kind of delaying and debate, what does it say about attitudes towards renters, especially those with the lowest incomes?
Toronto's had a long history of appealing to this silent majority, and the silent majority is homeowners, people who own their own homes. And they've always had the power on city council. City councilors are beholden to voters who own their own homes for a variety of reasons. Often, newcomers to Canada who can't vote will live in apartments. So the renters in Toronto haven't had the same kind of advocacy or advocates at Toronto City Council. And Toronto has a long history. If you go back to 100 years ago, 120 years ago, and looked at newspaper reports, and there's always this anti-apartment sentiment in the city, in the old city of Toronto. Apartments are transient and, the people who live in apartments don't contribute to the community. They're just here and there. Whereas people who own their own homes, those are all the kind of right and proper people of Toronto. So there's always been this kind of sensibility around that. But during this debate, it was just kind of said so overtly. Like the silent majority. The silent majority in Toronto is the only majority we talk about, right? Everything is about owning a home here. You hardly hear anything about renting. Even in the last election 2 weeks ago, the federal election, everything's about owning a home, The housing crisis is about getting a home. You barely heard a peep about renters. And that's the problem across Canada, not just Toronto, is that, renters hardly have any advocates among our elected officials relative to homeowners.
Which is surprising to me, considering that sort of renting culture has increased over the past few years. And even as various councillors sort of spoke about and for homeowners, their own wards, as you mentioned, are reflective of a very different reality, right? There's a lot of talk about homeowners, but there's a lot of renters in those wards, including millennials and Gen Zers, who now I hear they're talking about being renters for life because of the market and the cost of living in the city. So this discourse should kind of be reflective of that, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Toronto's becoming a giant city like other giant cities in the world where a lot of people rent, right? Like the idea of owning your own home is economically and spatially out of reach for a lot of people. This is based on the 2016 census. So the most recent census, once those figures are in, it might actually be higher, but 47% of Torontonians rent. And there was one councillor, Denzel Min Wong, in Don Valley East. So that's Don Mills, that kind of area. And he was talking about homeowner rights. We have to talk about homeowner rights as if we don't talk about homeowner rights enough. but 55% of his constituents rent. So he's actually like insulting the people that he's supposed to represent by telling them that they don't matter. And that's just incredible. And it's a testament to how confident they feel in this silent majority, feeling unthreatened that they can throw away, the majority of voters in some of these wards without worrying that it's going to blow back at election time.
And he's a deputy mayor, in fact, and he talked about those who pay taxes and live in stable residential neighborhoods, which kind of points towards a lot of the misconceptions you're talking about and bias that exists towards non-owners and renters. I mean, I rent and I pay taxes as well, quite a lot of them.
Yeah, it's a myth that renters don't pay taxes that often gets dipped into. And Min and Wong, who is the deputy mayor, and Mayor Tory picked him, and Mayor Tory ran on a housing platform, and his deputy mayor says this stuff without censure, it seems, perpetuated the myth that renters don't pay taxes, as if landlords are these benevolent entities that pay the tax for all their renters. The tax is baked into the rent for everyone. We all pay tax, whether you see it yourself on a bill or it's just baked into your rent.
And like you said, there's always talk about the silent majority, and it's always a silent majority narrative, which is a particular demographic. So do you view this as an equity and race-based issue as well? We know that these affordable living options are disproportionately sometimes the only choice available to immigrants and racialized groups who've also been the worst affected, we've seen, by the pandemic and the housing issues that are continuing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an economic issue, so it's absolutely going to have a race angle to it. Disproportionately, the people who are lower income in the city, are racialized people or are newcomers trying to get a foothold in here. And so this just makes it extra hard. It's just another kind of bureaucratic wall. We think of Toronto, we think of Canada as this place of endless opportunities. But right here, we can see elected officials stifling some of that opportunity for an awful lot of people.
And can I just be blunt and discuss the NIMBYistic aspect of this debate? Am I allowed to say that? I mean, that seems to be reflective of some parts of society as well, right?
Yeah, the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard people, won't like you saying that because nobody likes to be called a NIMBY. But absolutely, these councillors are appealing to it. One of the councillors, Paul Ainsley in Scarborough, he said, I talked to a lot of my constituents and they don't want it, right? And why don't you want it? And again, it goes back to that old Toronto sensibility of not liking renters around you, But I live in the old city, downtown Toronto, downtown West Side, more or less. And, there's rooming houses up and down our street and it's fine. Living around renters, it's just fine. The houses are still worth stupid amounts of money and, the sky doesn't fall. So it's a really pervasive, but also corrosive thing that's perpetuated by councillors. And this is where we need leadership to actually say, no, this is not the right thing to do. I am the representative of this part of Toronto, and there's almost 50% of people here who rent. I have to defend them as much as I defend the property owners.
And ironically, as there's procrastination on this issue, whereas at the same time, the city was heavily criticized for its incredibly heavy-handed and high cost of these recent violent encampment evictions that we saw, which cost around $2 million, I believe. And meanwhile, here is a means perhaps to address some of the root of that problem. And there's a lack of any decisive action on that front. Why do we see this duality and sort of double standard in where the city chooses to exercise forceful decisions and over whom it does that?
It's almost as if these two separate things, they're not separate, but if they were separate and happening in different times or something, it would almost be like too much to have them happening at the same time. Like the city evicted all these folks and there's not enough actual housing for them. And then the city, through council, prevents some of the first steps to getting housing at the same time, right? Because rooming houses would be the cheapest place to live, like we said, like people who don't have a lot of money, don't have a lot of credit. So, people just like my aunt who had no money in the 1940s, this was the first step. So it's a level of housing that is, I think, invisible to a lot of people. And that's why it has been easy for, these councillors and et cetera to block it. But it just kind of blows my mind that you can do this shock and awe campaign of evicting people, not solving anything, and then blocking the first step to permanent housing. It's unfathomable, but it happened.
Kind of countering each other. So what do we do to address this, to try and put an end to this constant delaying on this front? And how important is this issue in alleviating some of Toronto's housing woes that we keep talking about?
I mean, it's pretty complex. I think we need a new council and term limits and some of these councillors who have been in since like the 90s, some of them. But, if you're a renter in your ward and you feel like your councillor's not representing you, make some noise, write to them, tweet at them, but definitely write to them, email them, call them. They tend to listen to these things, especially if you can get a few neighbors involved, because once, a counselor hears from 1 or 2, 3 people about the same issue, and it appears that they're organized, talking behind and kind of coming out, that's when counselors start to listen. So that might be one way of changing some of this culture. But also if you're a homeowner and you see this happening, if you're being told that, your rights supersede others, you can also speak up. You can also say, this is not right. I like my neighbors who rent. I like my neighbors who own. So, being silent is perhaps the worst thing, a civilian can do right now.
I was just going to say, maybe try being the not so silent majority and speak up about this. Well, thank you so much for your time, Shawn. It was very refreshing to talk to you about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma.
I was talking to the Star's contributing columnist, Shawn Micallef. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sabai Tazaz. The This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Mutter, and Sean Pattenton. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenton. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.